Poker podcaster Sam sits in his room as he awaits for the initiation of an episode of the Two Table podcast. He smirks as he thinks about what he'll discuss with his brother Ben in the latest installment.
All right.
Welcome, everybody, to the latest episode of the Two Table Poker podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Legend of Ben on Poker Stars.
And I'm your other host, East Coast Sam on Poker Stars. And today we are going back to the past, all the way back to the magical year of 1973. The Watergate scandal was going on. Richard Nixon was president, and the World Series of Poker was on television. It wasn't just Norman Chad in the 2000s. We're going to Jimmy the Greek all the way back to 1973. This was something I've been wanting to do for a while, so I'm really excited for this.
So, we talk about how kind of the classic main event era of ESPN was beginning in 2003. But really, the main event existed decades before then. Plenty of folks maybe, but prior to Poker Go, probably didn't even have access to this archive kind of way back to the 1970s, 1980s of these main events. And these were kind of broadcasted in kind of like a television special, not like not quite like ESPN. We watched this probably on ESPN back then. If ESPN was a thing back then, I don't think it was. It's really something else. And even as we've discussed ad nauseum about how each main event differs from the one before it, even these sort of classic broadcasts of these main events, most of the final tables at times do go through a subtle evolution year to year or years to year. But before we get into that, I think we'd be remiss not to discuss our sort of reaction, our analysis of our incredible interview of Mr. Philip Hilm. Again, one of my favorites that we've done up until this point. I really enjoyed our talk with him.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was a blast to hear from him, not just about his experience at the main event in 2007, but also his previous experiences in poker, as well as his experiences afterward, as well as with real estate and artificial intelligence. So if you haven't checked it out, go and do that. Philip also has a number of talks that you can find online. He has a TED talk, as well as a couple other stuff about artificial intelligence. We talked a little bit about that, but if you want to hear him go into more detail, I really encourage you to watch those talks. They're a blast to watch.
And a shout out to all our fans who commented on Reddit and on YouTube about our content recently. Thank you for your support. We're always great to hear from our listeners. We always want to take suggestions. One of our suggestions was to maybe have a big cash game player in a future interview. So we'll be looking into a few potential players to maybe scratch that itch as far as not only covering interviewing people that were a part of the main event in the summer, but that will be in the future. And Philip, thank you again for your sharing the interview with your friends and family. We had a great response, and it was one of our most successful videos, actually. So thank you.
Yeah, and feel free to check out our other interviews as well. I mean, they're all great. We have John Hesp, we have Michael Davinsky, we have Ernest Wiggins, the 3 out of 4 guy. We have a lot of content on this channel. So, if you're coming for the first time listening to our podcast after the Philip Hilm stuff, feel free to stick around. We also talk about poker movies as well as main event coverage. So feel free to check it out.
Yeah, and on that note, let's get right into our main topic here. We're covering chronologically the first 4 main event broadcasts that were at least available on Poker Go, that being 1973, 1978, 1979, and 1981. And so 1973 is still very early in the history of the main event. This was back when there was only 13 players that bought in for the $10,000 buy-in, as always. And at this structure, it was winner take all.
Yeah, I mean, it makes for a very different experience. I mean, obviously, 13 players, okay, that sounds like a walk in the park, but you had Amarillo Slim, you had Puggy Pearson, you had Bobby Brazil. You had a lot of people in this game who were the best of the best during their time period. So, it was they were definitely hyping this up. It was definitely a big deal to have 13 players. It was the biggest main event at the time, 13. I know it just sounds so silly to say 13 players out loud at the main event, but yeah, I mean, this was like an all-night affair, no breaks, cigarette smoke in the air. I mean, it was a big deal.
Yeah, and Jimmy the Greek provides the commentary. Obviously, he was kind of before our time, so I wasn't familiar with who he was, but he had a very lengthy television career. And so I guess there must have been some minor star power associated with him being kind of the head honcho for this broadcast. This main event is shown in about 47, 48 minutes chunk. so it'd probably fit about a 1 hour time slot during television. And again, you mentioned some big names in the field, also Bill Brunson. Again, a very young Bill Brunson, kind of coming in that era where he would pull off back-to-back main event wins, and so obviously he a big part of the game back then. Less so now, but again, he's still playing the main event. Even last year he did. So great to see him kind of 50 years ago, almost 50 years ago. This was 49 years ago. So that it's pretty incredible. A little over half his life ago.
That's true. He looked so old back then too. It's just like crazy to think like, wow, that was 50 years ago and he's still around. Yeah, it's crazy.
Now, obviously, getting to the sort of production style of this entire main event, this one in particular kind of takes the vibe of a nature documentary. Kind of feels like the poker players at the table. They play all day. They play 2 cards. He has a big hand. It's a very unusual style. It's almost treat them as if they're animals by virtue of being a nature documentary.
Yeah, there's no whole cards, so we're only seeing cards if they're flipped up on their backs. A lot of sort of speculation and sort of almost like quasi-philosophical equations of the poker to different things. An amateur busts first in the tournament, and Jimmy the Greek says that it's an affirmation of life that he loses first. There's observations about the casino that they're playing poker in, which I like because I think it kind of adds a little bit of a like almost mystical element to the game. It adds this, makes it seem larger than life. And it befits as well. Like a lot of these guys are larger than life. They have these thick Southern accents where you're just expecting gravy and biscuits to fall out of their mouth. This is Crandall Addington. This is Johnny Moss. These are the legends of the game who are in their youth, in their prime, playing this out. It takes on this dimension as a person who's grown up in the 2000s and was watching poker then. It takes on this dimension then in turn and look back 30 years in the past.
Yeah, and this exact main event was played over the course of 2 days.
Mm-hmm.
The first day they played down to the final 6, which was kind of funny considering we had discussed how final table is in the mid 2010s, kind of like it would begin with 6 players. So it's kind of maybe sort of a throwback or a reference to that. I'm not sure.
Maybe.
When the action actually gets down to the final 10, we kind of get like a lay of the land, a little bit of information on each player at the table, their backgrounds, who they are, their name, etc., all that stuff. So I guess with 13 players, it would have been kind of awkward to have gone to like 2 6-hand, 7-hand tables and done that. But I'm just a little surprised they chose to structure it like that, considering that the final table wasn't even the final 10; it was the final 6. And it's also winner take all, so it's not like there's a money bubble per se to really kind of get a sense of who needs the money the most or something like that. But it's something else, really. I considering this was my first watch of these 4 main events, it was a unique experience. I probably wouldn't watch it again, but I'm kind of glad I saw it in this kind of raw, very very retro television form. I always have an issue of watching like really old movies or TV. It just kind of annoys me sometimes how slow it can be or how kind of bland the directorial style can be sometimes for those kind of things. But I didn't mind as much in this case for the novelty of it.
Yeah, in terms of going into the hand action or whatever, it's kind of hard to talk about because, again, we don't have whole cards. Sometimes the pre-flop action isn't stated. There's a couple interesting plays here and there where we're heads up. Moss makes this big river bet, and Puggy Pearson, who's going up against him, goes into the tank for a while and, thinks through different things, eventually says, I don't think he got spades, Johnny, and calls and wins the hand. And that's what sort of propels him to win the championship. So, clearly these guys are good players. But yeah, it's hard to talk strategy just because that's not what the coverage is about. It really is about going into these guys' personalities, giving you a sense of what the casino is like. Probably in 1973, a lot of people hadn't heard of the World Series of Poker at all. So this is almost certainly an introduction to whoever watched it. I don't know what the ratings were. Right. I don't know what channel this aired on, so I don't know what exactly, how much coverage this got. But, odds are this was an introduction for many, many people. And I think it's an effective one at that. Like, I'd agree with you. I don't really feel the need to watch this again. But, somebody who does like stuff from the 1970s, I think it's a little fun to watch.
And the one benefit of having only 13 players is that each bust out is basically referenced or shown. So compared to maybe later main events where they skip ridiculous, like final 2 table knockouts in the end, it was kind of funny to see that 1973 did get it correctly, at least in that respect for that. The final quarter of the episode is just a heads up play when they're and Moss against Pearson. They're pretty equally matched in chips. That's another thing is that one of my least favorite parts of Helmuth's commentary was when he would refer to chips as dollars. Like he puts $500,000 on this, and but at least in the main event back then, when it was 10K bind and 10K chips, the chips have a 1-to-1 dollar to chip ratio at least. So when someone's and they're playing with literally each buy-in basically because of it's winner take all. So the money kind of that analogy, that style of speaking like that kind of makes sense more in this context than it would be in say 2010 or something like that. So that it was kind of nice to have that sort of that kind of vibe to it, I guess, to kind of make up for the future commentary faux pas, I think. But later, the next couple of main event specials will do a bit more detail into the dynamics of a particular hand or what the cards are and etc. with the commentary. So that kind of picks up better. But in this format, it's not part of the strategy for the broadcast.
Yeah, I mean that's fine. I mean, you do get a sort of sense of how poker is at the time. I mean, one thing I noticed across all these episodes is how people put out their chips. They don't, nowadays you would put all of your chips out and that would count as like, a raise or a call or whatever. But there's just so much string betting. Like it's not even funny. Like they'll bring out one stack and then another one and then another one and then another one. It's like, are you calling? Are you raising? What are you doing? And Johnny Moss also at one point gets insurance. Like, is that allowed in tournament poker? Like, I had no idea.
A different game back then. Not to mention, the table talk does get shown at some points unedited, but other times there is commentary over it or we don't hear it. So it makes sometimes seeing if these are string raises or whatever a bit tougher if we didn't hear like the word raise before he puts moving chips in, because that is common. People say I raise and then they put the call out and then they put the raise out afterwards. So that there's some wiggle room a little bit there, but I totally agree if that was just observation I noticed too. Not to mention they didn't really color up chips very well towards the end, so they kind of have these like mountains of outdated chips by heads up sometimes. So that was a little strange. But nonetheless, that also I guess I don't know if you noticed, but the smallest chip denomination was not the $25 chip, because sometimes it was like $5 or $10 was like the ante or something. So like the ante and blind structure are also very different.
Right.
They had antes like from level 1 onward, and the usual in modern poker the ante was often like 1/3 or 1/4 of the small blind, and here it's like 40% or something. It's a bit more aggressive, and it's not really a main focus of these old broadcasts, but I was very intrigued by. I wonder when that change really happened, was when the math of the blinds and ante structure of running tournaments is we even saw that evolve quite a bit in the 2022 World Series Poker. So it's just another observation I make looking back on these old main events.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it does seem like the tournament progressed fairly slowly. I mean, when they got down to 6-handed, the day ended at 3 a.m. I mean, and then they're back playing poker the very next day. I mean, again, these guys were old school. I mean, we're talking about these guys who like sit at the table for 20 hours and play poker and then, go home, sleep for 4 hours and then be back in the casino the next day. So I'm sure they were used to very long structures, a very slow blind structure and long days. So, it is interesting to think about, like, could a modern player with all their knowledge they have compete back then, given how different putting in your chips was and how different putting in the blinds is? And it's an interesting thought.
I mean, I don't think that, people think that the poker player from 2003 was a million times worse than the player from 2013 or 2022. So I'd like to think maybe that you put in the Granu or a Helmuth into this field and they take it down, but luck obviously is involved too. And we do know that the bet sizing can be so funky in these sort of old era poker tournaments that you have to wonder if that would increase the variance to the degree that it would really hurt a modern pro's chances of winning these tournaments. But it's a good thought to have.
Yeah.
But that kind of takes us to 1978. So 5 years later, as part of the CBS Sports Spectacular, which is kind of funny given that poker airs on CBS Sports nowadays. So there's obviously some ancient history there. Even the ESPN is an ABC corporation. So I'm a little confused there. But anyway, 1978, year to year, the main event was growing. A few more amateurs were kind of entering the field. Still, again, we're talking 42 players here, so not moneymaker level growth year to year. But that the field was changing. There were still the same pros from '73 and from those years in between, but obviously it was expanding slowly and surely. But this main event only 20 minutes long, so less than
Right.
half the length of '73. That surprised me.
Yeah, it's just not enough time to really establish anything. I mean, you start the video and you have no context for what's going on, like all of a sudden you're playing poker. Um, yeah, I mean, it's a very abbreviated. It does go into a little bit more detail about hands and who's playing what and whatever,
Yeah.
and tries to build up a bit of a narrative. Bobby Baldwin wins this year. Spoilers for anyone who was going to plan on watching this. But he's sort of seen as like the young gun of the game. He was more analogous to Daniel Negreanu, or the young guns that are in the game now. Like he's the young rising star of it, and there's a lot of coverage of him and the hands that he plays, and some of his table talk as well. And it does a decent job establishing that narrative, I guess, but it's still just far too abbreviated in order to be completely effective.
Yeah, I mean, it just kind of feels like almost like a live reporter is just like taking, broadcasting, coming to you live from Las Vegas. We're here in the middle of day 2 of the tournament. I mean, the action in the episode here, or if you want to call it episode, begins like partway into like day 2 in the middle
Yeah.
of the hand of all times. So it's very strange, as if like they just didn't care. Um, the reporter talks to Pearson and Moss about the new young kids on the block playing, and by the time really the action with 6 left again, we're on the money bubble because there are 5K slots for a 42-person tournament by this point. They do show the chip graphics and the payout graphics on screen. It's just kind of very simple, like normal letters. So at least that was sort of the origin of the sort of on-screen graphics in these main event broadcasts. But again, with 20 minutes long, you have to establish each player to a minor degree, and then actually get into some good poker action. The heads up play is actually pretty good considering how quick this whole thing moves, as far as going into the thought process and the mechanics of each hand. Addington against Baldwin heads up. There's sort of a big 10-9 bluff hand by Baldwin, and then the final hand, a set over set on the flop situation. Pretty wild. It's funny how large a percentage of a lot of these hands in these 1970s, 80s main events are just big pair over big pair, because really, back then the cliche was if you raised enough times, it was, aces, kings, or queens pre-flop guaranteed. And you don't see a lot of ace-5 suiteds or the 9-8 suiteds really like you see nowadays, as far as hands that are played at high frequency. So as a result, you're going to see a lot of coolers like that.
Yeah, I mean that's one thing I noticed, is that a lot of the action is fairly tight. I mean, Baldwin messing around with 9-10. I mean, that definitely makes him stand out, as well as with Jack 4 against Addington at one point. So he's definitely a little bit more willing to mix it up, and you can see why he was able to win this tournament. But yeah, I mean, until you get to heads up, I mean, the poker play is just a lot of bust out hands, which I always hate. I always hate when it's just a bunch of bust out hands and then a little bit of heads up and then that's it. Um, it's again good to see, sort of get a sense of what the game is right now. Puggy Pearson is talking about the young players at a couple points and how they're getting better and you have to keep improving your game. So, you get a little taste of the poker world, but I really don't understand the decision behind cutting to it in the middle of a hand, not having just at least a brief montage explaining what day 1 was like. I don't know if this was part of an anthology series or something, or a news report. I don't know. It's just very unusual, the editing style.
Yeah, and again, it's just so quick. You blink and it's over. So it's a bit of a shame. But I mean, they did go to a bit more detail in the poker side of things compared to '73. So at least they got that evolution started. Because moving on to the very next main event, 1979, which is almost double in length, about 38 minutes 40 seconds long, with the return of Jimmy the Greek, and then Frank as the reporter, kind of interviewing players. This is actually originally 2 parts, I think, and then it was just put in on Poker Go in one big video, because there's kind of a halfway point where it's like kind of ends and then it restarts, kind of recapping and then getting back into the action at the final table with 5 left. So you can't hide that sort of editing tricks from me. I'm going to always notice that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fine. It's no big deal to have it be in two parts,
Yeah.
especially because you give more time to really let this event play out. Have some, interesting faces in there. A young Gabe Kaplan, just like straight out of Central Casting in the '70s, talking about how he's an amateur player, mixing it up in here. Also mentioned two women playing the main event for the first time, as well as just, again, like as I mentioned, just like they have Kenny Rogers in here too. I forget, I want to just mention that the guy who does "You Got to Know When to Hold Them, Know When to Fold Them." That
So many
song.
times, like it's
Yeah.
unbelievable. Every commercial break that exists in the and they use that. Uh,
Yeah.
and so with this one, I'm pretty because volleyball were under one, you kind of had the volleyball effect going on here. So the field increased to 54 players, which again that's a 12-player increase. And remember, in 1973, that the whole field was 13, so you had almost the
Right.
whole tournament in there added on. So again, 5 pay spots; those are mentioned. How much money goes to each one? That was established early. That was good. We do see the opening blinds and antes, as well as the chip color such denominations right off the bat, which I was surprised by. I wouldn't have anticipated that being a thing way back then.
Right.
And $270,000 for first place, so about half of the total buy-in. So again, back when the main event took the Binions took no rake on the main event, so there was no sort of 10% coming out of the prize pool. And again, there's a little bit of a rule explanation during the intro. There was also a little bit of that in 73 as well, kind of covering the basics for
Hmm.
the total newbies to the poker world. So that was pretty good. But then in this first half, there's this interview of this guy named Minnesota Fats, who has the most dead empty stare you'll ever see on television just before he actually speaks. I laughed at that one a lot.
Yeah, I mean, all these nicknames. I mean, Chicago Sam, Minnesota Fats, Lakewood Louie. I mean, this is just, you'd love to have this be in a movie, and it's in real life.
Yeah.
It's very good.
But day one is covered in this first part. They play from 54 down to 20 players.
Hmm.
And I took note of once again the very unusual anti-blind structure where it was like 2-3-6, so like a 200 ante, 300 small blind, 600 big blind. That's just it's just very crazy
Yeah.
how aggressive that structure was.
Yeah, I mean, you can't play tight. I mean, it's interesting that they have that blind structure given how tight these players are supposed to be. I mean, really have to be playing a lot of hands. I mean, it's so much money if you're a small stack. It's just crazy. And if you're a big stack, you can bully people. It's just insane.
No. And so the editing style again cuts to a couple hands and a couple interviews with either Frank or Jimmy the Greek talking about it. It's pretty similar to 78 actually, but it just has more time to detail more of the table action. Um, it goes from day one to day two where we actually see a royal flush take happen. That was kind of cool because a royal flush it's so rare that you just hope that when it happens you get it on camera. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah, apparently like the first royal flush at the World Series is what they said. So that's nice.
Yeah, and captured on film. I mean, it wasn't just like, oh, by the way, we heard that Puggy Pearson had a royal flush on day one.
Right.
So we actually see it. By the end of part one, there's a pretty crazy hand where again it's a pair over pair, set over set, or situation that ends up busting the defending champ Baldwin. And it's pretty funny. That's a pretty regular occurrence. I would say like almost as much as maybe like a third of the bust outs in these classic main events are like that kind of run out where flop on the flop, river or turn, two outer to bust a player that was all in after flipping a set. So pretty crazy. It's not rigged.
Right. Yeah. I mean, they are definitely cutting hands to show the juiciest ones. But yeah, I mean, it is crazy how that just keeps happening. It's ugly.
So by part two of this, so the halfway point of the 79 main event special, we had the final table of 5 players left: Bobby Hoff, Fowler, Johnny Moss, Hubler, and Moon.
Mhm.
And I've again, I don't really know most of these players, so it's not like I'm like, oh my god, it's him. Oh, it's so cool. But again, there's some pretty good breakdown of given this 20 minutes for the final 5 to really kind of go into the chips flowing from one player to the other one. This player goes out, this player is rising. That does feel a bit more prominent in the sort of the play out of the tournament compared to say other main events where that last episode so rushed to get all the bust outs in there.
Yeah, and the narrative is that Fowler is the amateur. He's the guy that's just kind of come out of nowhere, and here he is.
Yeah.
And he plays again. There's not too many hands to talk about, but I mean, he plays fine. I mean, he gets an ace high flush over a king high flush. That's always incredibly sick to see. He eventually, spoilers, wins. But he's not really, he's not a name that we've really heard of since. It's possible maybe he just caught cards, maybe he just managed to maneuver his stack and find lucky moments, but they do try to build that narrative, and it gets there somewhat.
Yeah, and Bobby Hoff, rest in peace. I remember my only experience watching him was during season 2 of the Poker Superstars Invitational, way back. I want to say like 2004 or 5, like quite a while ago, and he didn't really have much personality in that show. Not that he doesn't have any, but just that the other kind of show doesn't really lend itself well to that. But Fowler, again, not someone that pops to the top of my list of most memorable or favorite main event winners. But again, that's going to happen when you have all these old main event winners that you can't see in modern day playing poker, so it's kind of hard to be a fan of them nowadays. But nonetheless, again, it's nothing special, this main event, but at least it had more time to breathe than 78 did. So that maybe puts it one notch ahead of 78 for me, but not below 73.
Yeah, I give it a notch above 78 just for the beginning, where you just have this montage, everyone showing up in these 1970s cars, and then Binion shows up on a horse. I think he one-ups Phil Hilm with all his entrances there. That was awesome.
Yeah. No, that's pretty cool. But that leads us to the last and also the longest of these first 4 old main events, 1981, which was made in a 65-minute, I think 3-part, again, 20 minutes each, sort of special, hosted by Curt Gowdy, who I didn't know much about, but I'm just kind of gonna have myself here, but I think this is the weakest of the 4. Actually, it's the most poorly constructed and the most unfocused, and Stu Ingar gets really like the short end of the stick here with the attention he gets to.
Yeah, I mean, you're figuring this is Stu Ingar's second year. There's a very natural narrative. Here's this guy that won the previous year. He's the returning champion coming back. He's still very young, and for a lot of people, they probably thought that it was a fluke, him winning the previous year, beating Doyle Brunson heads up. So there's a very natural narrative here. And then you have a lot of other players like Green, who this Alaskan amateur coming to Las Vegas. There's a lot of stories that you can build here. But yeah, I mean, they just really don't do a great job building it. Nothing super exciting in terms of the hands we see. It's fine, especially when we get to heads up. We get a little bit of sense of how Ingar and Green play against each other. And again, a little bit more of how the game is. Amarillo Slim gets interviewed, Crandall Addington gets interviewed, all these players. You get to hear from them again, hear their spin on the game. But yeah, I mean, nothing to really hang your hat on.
Well, the one thing this special did differently was that Baldwin kind of, after he busts, which is funny because he's introducing the rules at the start of the episode, and then which begins at the final table without telling us it was a final table at first, and then he actually joins Curt in the commentary booth after he busts in like 7th place. But the funny thing is that it's kind of ambiguous how these were commented on. Like, was it done after they knew what the cards were and then added in afterward? Was it done live? Because there's kind of some ambiguity, because sometimes they'll show the cards a player has during a hand as if it was live, even though it's not live if they know the cards. But it had to be on a hand that the cards get turned face up. So it's kind of that quandary of, because at least we know of law and norm when something was produced after the fact. Obviously, they watched it, then made up the commentary afterwards. Whereas here, it's a bit more blurry of a line that they're kind of crossing here when they were constructing this. So that was a little bizarre. But this entire 65 minutes is only the final table. At least the other ones had some non-final table action, but because it's in about an hour of just the final table, it's just really slow.
Yeah, it's hard to describe even, because I usually like a lot of final table action where it takes its time and you see
Yeah.
how things develop and all that. But yeah, it does just come off as kind of slow. And I think part of it is the way is what you just brought up, that they don't have whole cards, so you don't see what the cards are at the beginning. They don't say something like, Stu Unger has pocket queens, green has ace king. They like wait to reveal that later on, and they try to treat it like it's a surprise almost, like, oh, here he is betting. What does he have in his hand? Ace king. And that just makes each hand feel a lot slower. And it also makes it harder for you to follow what exactly is going on. Like multiple times, I was like, I had to go back in order to check the action or see what the hand was.
Yeah.
Like they would just like flash a like almost like a picture of two cards on the screen, be like, those are pocket aces. It's like what? Like, can't you just have graphics on the screen? It's yeah, it slows the action down. And Bobby Baldwin's not terrible as a commentator, but doesn't bring a whole lot of life to it. He's often just kind of commenting on what the journalist is commenting on and not really adding his own spin to it. There's no shtick between the two of them like there is between Lon and Norm. Yeah, it just comes off as oddly boring.
Not to mention the actual treatment of Stu Unger is completely ridiculous. He just is kind of shown in there. Oh, by the way, he won it last year. It's like you need to be like he needs to be like in the intro. He needs to be talked about like how he won the year prior, why they think he's going to win it again, or what they think he has to do differently compared to last year. Give us something because he should be the main character of this really as a defending champ. As
Yeah.
a young kid, as a defending champ, and he's just shown in there like, he's there, but we don't know if he's going to win. But whatever. And I mentioned how this is kind of three parts broken into one whole big special. So part one ends with four left, over half the bust outs. Part two ends as heads up's beginning. So we get 22 minutes of just heads up, and that's normally, heads up poker is pretty cool on TV or in movies, but it just that doesn't work for me as anything suspenseful. Even though I knew that Unger was going to win, I still want to have some suspenseful hands in there, be like, oh, is he going to make the call? Because you don't know how it's going to end. It might end on this hand or the next hand after that in the edit. You never know that. And I don't know. I mean, I said before, I'm not a huge fan of old by my standards television, and this just kind of confirms my bias of that.
Yeah, I mean, again, nothing uber exciting in terms of the hands here that you can say. Unger, I think, deserved to win. We see him winning a lot toward the back half. Green just doesn't manage to get a whole lot going. There's one hand where Green calls the clock on Unger, which I thought was kind of interesting, but we don't really have enough time to see like how long Unger was in the tank for. Like Green shoves, it kind of cuts to Unger for a moment, and then it cuts back to Green calling the clock. I would have liked to have gotten a little bit of a feel for how long he was sitting there for. Yeah, I mean, again, I think, my favorite parts of this just might be the segments of all these classic old time players talking about poker and what they do, how, Crandall Addington wears a suit and tie in order to keep himself disciplined, which kind of reminds me of Max Steinberg a little bit. Green talks about how he plays in Alaska and how it's a hard way to make a hard living playing poker. Just these little folksy moments here and there that just remind you of what the game used to be. Ken Smith with his top hat on, just little things here and there. But yeah, overall, it's just not too interesting.
I mean, it's just kind of big hand runs into big hand, runs into big hand. That's just not very, very, not a very variety pack of different hands. It's just kind of pair of queens on a 10 high board against 3 10s. Oh, great. Here we go again.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a bluff mixed in there here and there, but really not as much as you would like to see in an exciting final table of the main event.
Yeah, I mean, again, all the players are so tight. There's not too many bluffs. There's not too many crazy hands. It's I can only imagine what the other hands that we didn't see were like. I mean, probably a lot of folds, a lot of raise and takes, and all that stuff.
Yeah. And unfortunately, because of that, there's really not a ton you can learn like poker wise. If you were just like a complete novice to poker and you watch this, I don't think you'd really be able to learn all that much because you learn, oh, if I have kings, I'm gonna run into aces every time or something. You're just not gonna learn anything that you can maybe use in your real play when you're on your own at home or whatever. I would say there is some novelty as far as seeing what poker looked and felt like, almost 50 years ago, 40 years ago. That there is some value there. I'm happy that PokerGo does have these in their archive, but I can't really, in all honesty, recommend any of these on their merits, more just kind of on their flaws, if anything. And there's plenty. I mean, for the most part, I mean, obviously they skipped a couple of years here and there in this span of time, but there's a good number of them going all the way up to 2002 where Varconi wins. But I don't know. I kind of feel like just the look and vibe kind of stays the same the whole way up until then.
Yeah, I mean, it's not until ESPN starts to put their back into it, because then it became sort of hour-long specials every year at the final table. Then in '03, they said, we're really going to commit to this. And again, just, got lucky with Moneymaker and all that being in there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, you really need to have whole cams in order to make this work. You need to have graphics on the screen so you know what the bet sizes are. And then, yeah, I mean, it's a shame because, again, like all these guys have a lot of personality, and there's some table talk that happens and interesting life stories here, a good mix of professionals and amateurs making deep runs. It's just they didn't quite have it, maybe they didn't have the footage, or maybe they didn't have the money to really put together and create a seamless show. But if they had that, then I think these would be really good. But it's just not quite there.
Yeah, if someone had like the security camera footage of these rooms while they're going on, just sort of took that and then it reconfigured it and made something special, that could have been pretty cool. But
yeah.
Unfortunately, we can't. But it did set the stage for the poker television that we know in today. So you have to think a little bit to
absolutely
bring it from way back then.
Absolutely.
But I think that kind of covers our thoughts. So this, again, it's pretty brief. We're really only discussing four, on average, maybe like 40-minute long, specials here. So not a ton to talk about when they're pretty similar to each other, all things considered, besides maybe the first one.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it's a good sense of where poker was, and what the culture was like, what the casino environment was like. If you're interested, if you're a completionist, I'd say give them a shot. Otherwise, you can move on to other endeavors.
Yeah. But I think that just about wraps up this episode of our podcast. Thank you for listening. Again, let us know if you have any suggestions, comments, requests for other content for us to talk about, or if you want to be a special guest on our next episode. We're more than happy to have you. Any final words you have, Sam?
Yep, just again plugging the Mind Sport Olympiad taking place in January. No updates or anything, just wanted to remind you all, go do it. It's a great event. And yeah, as Ben said, if you're at all interested in being on the show, let us know. Feel free to also leave comments on any of our videos with your thoughts on what we're saying. We'd love to have a conversation with you. You can always ask us questions. I'm happy to do like a Q&A segment where we get questions from you guys and you can ask us questions about our experiences and whatever. Yeah, again, anybody at all who's been on the main event, if you were before 2003 and you want to talk about poker, we're happy to have that. If you were from the Mind Sport Olympiad and you want to talk about your experiences there, we're happy to have you. Whatever you'd like, we'd love to have you on. And, we try to keep our conversations very informal. Ben and I will do some research, but, this is your opportunity to speak about what you want to see in poker and have a conversation with us.
Yeah, I know when to hold them, know when to fold them,
know
when to walk away, and know when to sign out. Bye,
guys. Right. Take care.